In Lexington, Kentucky, a place where families usually show up for one another without hesitation. Everything I believed about loyalty collapsed on the night my life was supposed to change for the better. My name is Courtney Weller, and what happened to me began with a choice my parents made so casually that I still feel the sting every time I think about it. I had invited them to something I described as important, something I hoped would finally make them look at me with the same pride they had always reserved for my sister. Instead of asking what the event was or why it mattered, they announced that they would attend her performance because, in their words, she needed them more. I did not argue that night, and I did not reveal what I had planned, although I knew the truth would surface eventually. What I did not expect was the moment it happened, or the way it tore through the relationships I had spent years trying to repair. When the wedding began and the cameras started rolling for the local broadcast arranged by someone who genuinely cared, the words that came from my father struck harder than I was prepared for. He stared at the screen and said, "Is that her wedding?" My mother followed with, "How could she do this to us?" My sister reacted with, "Turn that off right now." Those were the first cracks in a night that broke every fragile piece left between us. The story that follows is not gentle, and it is not the version anyone in my family expected to face. If you want more stories told with honesty and emotional truth, follow this channel so you never miss the next chapter. Before everything collapsed, I grew up in what looked like an ordinary family in Lexington. Although the reality behind that appearance revealed itself slowly as I got older, I never believed my childhood was extraordinary. Yet I carried a quiet awareness that affection did not fall evenly in our house. I understood this long before I had the vocabulary to describe it. My mother seemed to orbit around my sister in a way that felt intentional, even if no one ever called it favoritism aloud. It was a pattern woven into daily life, subtle enough to overlook, yet persistent enough to shape the way I saw myself. It began with small choices that accumulated until they formed an unmistakable picture. My sister, Melanie Carter, arrived in the world 3 years before me, and from what I gathered, she became the center of gravity almost immediately. I watched my mother light up whenever people praised Melanie for anything she did, while similar praise for me barely earned a nod. One of the earliest examples that stayed with me happened during a school art fair. I was 8 and thrilled because my drawing had been selected for a small display. We walked through the hallway and my mother seemed genuinely impressed until she spotted a ceramic bowl Melanie had made for a different project. She shifted toward it so quickly that I found myself talking to air, and she spent the next 10 minutes discussing glaze colors with her as if nothing else existed. I stood beside them and wondered how admiration could vanish so fast. A few years later, the same pattern resurfaced during a middle school awards night. I had quietly worked my way to the top of my science class and earned a small academic certificate. I still remember practicing my smile so I would not look nervous on stage. When I returned to my seat, my mother congratulated me with a tone that felt polite rather than proud. The moment ended when she mentioned how well Melanie performed in her choir rehearsal the same afternoon. It was not cruel or sharp, but it left a familiar heaviness in my chest. I learned to adjust my expectations so I would not feel the sting each time my accomplishments were overshadowed. My father offered a different kind of emotional distance. He was not cold, but he kept himself removed from the small fractures that appeared in our household. He rarely stepped in when my mother redirected attention toward my sister, and I often wondered if he noticed anything at all. His silence made the imbalance feel normal, as if the quiet parts of me were meant to remain quiet forever. I told myself that life would eventually level out once I grew older and found my own place in the world. I eventually met my husband, Jason Weller, during my first year working at a small nonprofit. He carried a calm steadiness that softened the edges of everything I had internalized growing up. Jason celebrated my achievements with a warmth that felt new, and it took time for me to understand that affection could be consistent rather than conditional. I worked hard in my career, moving from small administrative roles to a position where I managed outreach programs. While Jason recognized how much effort that required, my mother reacted as though I had chosen a path without significance. She often changed the subject when I tried to share progress from work, and she redirected the conversation to something related to Melanie. The contrast between my household and my marriage made the imbalance clearer than ever. These moments formed the foundation of the conflict that shaped everything that followed. They became the lens through which I interpreted every interaction with my family, especially as adulthood revealed deeper consequences of those early patterns. 1 year earlier, I decided to get engaged, and the choice felt like a turning point I had waited for through many complicated seasons of my life. Jason had proposed in a quiet moment that carried genuine sincerity rather than spectacle, and I accepted with a feeling that blended excitement and relief. I believed this news might shift something inside my family, and I hoped it would inspire a warmer response than the ones I had grown accustomed to. I approached the conversation with cautious optimism because I wanted to give them a chance to meet me where I stood rather than where they preferred me to remain. I told myself that sharing this moment openly might invite a small step towards something closer to balance. I told my parents about the engagement during a Sunday visit that seemed uneventful until that moment. My mother reacted with a restrained expression that suggested she was processing information she did not ask for. She offered a soft acknowledgement that carried no emotion, and I felt the air settle in a way that reminded me of earlier years. My father responded with a simple nod before returning his attention to a magazine he had been paging through. Their reactions felt familiar enough that I managed to keep my posture steady. Yet the familiarity stung in a deeper place because I had hoped adulthood would change something about the way they received me. I tried to interpret their responses generously, although a quiet ache formed beneath my attempts to stay composed. Meline delivered her reaction with an ease that belonged to someone who believed she did not need to filter herself. She looked at me with a smile that did not reach her eyes, and asked, who would even care enough to attend my wedding? Her voice had a light tone that pretended to be playful, though the words landed sharply. I took a slow breath and told her that the day mattered to me, even if it mattered to no one else. She shrugged in a way that dismissed the entire exchange, and I felt the familiar tension return to my shoulders. I had spent years letting her comments pass without confrontation, and this moment did not break that pattern, though I wished I had the courage to challenge her entitlement more directly. I carried the weight of those responses into the following week, and I realized how much emotional fatigue I had learned to mask. The person who noticed the shift in me was my best friend, Colin Reyes, who had known me long enough to understand the difference between my silence and my disappointment. I told him everything during a long phone call, where I finally allowed myself to express the frustration I kept concealed in front of my family. Colin listened without interrupting, and he reminded me that emotional support does not always come from the people we expect to provide it. He encouraged me to hold on to the parts of my life that felt steady and genuine, rather than dwell on the echoes of old wounds. His words allowed me to breathe more freely, if only for a brief moment, and I appreciated the clarity he offered during a time that felt heavier than it needed to be. I returned to my daily routine after that conversation, and I tried to quiet the lingering questions about what my engagement revealed about my family's dynamic. I reminded myself that emotional distance did not erase the significance of the commitment I had made to Jason. The following months required me to gradually reshape my expectations so I could move forward without waiting for my family to respond in a way that matched what I hoped to receive. It became clear that the engagement marked the beginning of a new chapter rather than a continuation of old patterns, and that realization settled into my thoughts with surprising clarity. 6 months ago, I started preparing for my wedding with the kind of determination that comes from years of being overlooked. I wanted the ceremony to feel genuine and grounded, something that belonged to me, rather than an afterthought squeezed between my sister's bright spotlights. When the date was set, I decided to send my family a message that simply said I had an important event coming up and that their presence mattered to me more than I liked admitting. I did not name the event because I wanted to see who cared enough to ask before giving them the details. My phone buzzed less than a minute later. My mother replied with absolute certainty that the night I had chosen happened to be the same night as Meline's performance, and that my parents needed to be in the audience to support her. I stared at her message for a moment, realizing that she had not bothered to ask what I was inviting them to, or why I described it as important. My father sent a short confirmation that he understood the schedule and that attending Meline's show made sense for the family. There was no curiosity in either message, only an assumption that my life could shift for hers whenever necessary. Meline followed a few minutes later and asked if this was another attempt to make her feel guilty for having a real career in the arts. She added a line that struck deeper than I expected when she asked whether anyone would even notice if I held an event without mentioning it to the family. I felt a tight pull behind my ribs because I realized she believed her own words. She had built an entire world where I existed only when I stood backstage holding something she might need. I did not respond to any of them. I wanted the silence to sit between us because silence revealed more than arguments ever could. If they truly cared, they would reach out again. And if they did not, their choice would confirm everything I had pushed aside for years. I reminded myself that the wedding was for me and for Jason, and that approval from people who had never shown up would not change the meaning of the day. A week later, Colin stopped by after finishing a late shift at the station. I told him about the messages and how fast the dismissal came. He listened with the same calm he always brought into tense moments, and reminded me that some families only notice value when someone else points it out. When I told him I worried about the ceremony, feeling small without extended family, Colin said the station had been experimenting with local lifestyle segments and that they were looking for community stories with heart. He said he could talk to his producer about covering the ceremony in a respectful way if I wanted the moment to be witnessed by more than a handful of people. His offer surprised me because he made it without pity or obligation. It felt like someone outside my world was giving the day the significance my parents refused to acknowledge. I told him I needed time to think because I did not want attention for the sake of attention. I wanted a wedding that reflected who I had become after growing up in the shadow of a household that overlooked anything that did not sparkle on stage. I spent the rest of the evening reviewing the guest list and finalizing details that made the ceremony feel more like a milestone I had earned. I knew my parents would ignore it, and even though the realization hurt, it also steadied me. Their absence would not diminish what the day meant, not after everything it had taken to reach this point. The wedding day finally arrived. The day opened with a feeling I had waited too long to claim as my own version of peace. The local TV station arrived early, bringing the full equipment and crew that Colin had helped arrange. They set up cameras, adjusted angles, and coordinated with guests to understand the key moments of the ceremony. I stood aside and watched, realizing that even though my family was absent, there were still people who truly cared enough to show up and ensure my day would be complete. Jason held my hand and told me that as long as we had each other, this day already held its meaning. When the ceremony began, I tried to keep myself grounded in the moment. The warmth of our friends, the sincerity in their wishes, and the atmosphere surrounding us made the day feel worth treasuring. Yet deep inside, I still felt the emptiness my parents had left behind. Every time my eyes moved across the space, I brushed against the truth that they had chosen to stand with Meline instead of me. I did not want to break the mood for anyone else, so I carried that ache in silence. While the ceremony continued backstage at Meline's performance venue, a television had been turned on to follow the news before her show. When my image appeared in my wedding dress on the live broadcast, the entire room froze. No one in my family had known ahead of time, and the shock quickly shifted into chaos. My dad reacted first. He stared at the screen and asked, "Is that her wedding?" My mom stepped closer, covering her mouth as she whispered in disbelief, "How could she do this to us?" Meline stood behind them, her expression darkening instantly. She snapped, "Turn that off." A backstage staff member slowly lowered the remote, but before he could switch the TV off, my dad turned to my mom with anger building in his eyes. He said that if she had known and kept it from him, it would be unforgivable. My mom panicked, insisting she had no idea. Their voices echoed through the space that had been preparing for Meline's performance, and the tension drew stares from everyone around them. Meline, unable to stand the attention, drifting away from her, lost her temper and accused me of intentionally ruining her big night to punish the family. Meanwhile, I was standing in the middle of my ceremony, smiling toward the camera. I had no idea that those words were echoing just a few blocks away. All I knew was that even without my family present, the ceremony continued with the sincerity I had hoped for. Jason tightened his grip on my hand as we exchanged vows. I looked into his eyes and felt that for the first time in many years, I was truly chosen. And even though I did not yet know what would happen when my family realized what they had seen, I held myself steady. Because that day belonged to us, not to anyone else. After the wedding, the aftermath spread across Lexington faster than I ever expected. The broadcast had reached far more people than I imagined, and within hours, the entire town seemed to move with one shared topic. Conversations drifted in grocery aisles, cafes filled with low murmurs, and coworkers sent cautious messages asking whether I was all right. My name was suddenly tied to a moment that felt both deeply personal and publicly exposed, and the attention created a strange mixture of validation and exhaustion. I wanted space to breathe, Yet, the story traveled with a speed that refused to give me room to collect myself. Mom began calling early the next morning, and her messages multiplied with a persistence that revealed something closer to panic than concern. She insisted that everything was a misunderstanding, claimed she never meant to hurt me, and asked why I allowed the whole city to see a moment that should have stayed within the family. The tone shifted from defensive to pleading, and the rapid change made it clear she wanted to rewrite what happened before anyone established a version she could not control. I let the calls ring because every attempt to respond felt like stepping back into a narrative centered on her rather than me. Dad reached out as well, though his messages carried a different energy. He asked if we could meet somewhere quiet and talk privately, and the hesitation in his words suggested he finally recognized how long I had carried the feeling of being secondary in my own family. The invitation came with no excuses and no accusations, but I still felt unable to meet him. I needed time to understand whether his request came from genuine clarity or from the pressure sweeping through Lexington. That uncertainty weighed heavily on me, and I decided silence was safer than entering another emotional collision before I was ready. Meline faced the most immediate consequences, and word of that reached me through neighbors before she contacted anyone herself. Sponsors questioned the reliability of working with someone whose family drama erupted during an important performance, and her director demanded an explanation for why she appeared distracted backstage. The pressure forced her to confront a reality she had avoided for years, and for the first time she could not hide behind applause or parental praise. The shift in her circumstances carried a sharp irony, and I found myself unsure whether to feel sympathy or relief. It was not revenge, but rather the natural result of choices she made without considering their impact. Jason noticed how the attention affected me before I said a word, and he stepped in with the calm steadiness that had anchored our relationship from the beginning. He kept our home quiet, handled messages from guests who wanted updates, and reminded me that I had every right to create distance from anyone who contributed to the pain that led to this moment. His support helped me reframe the chaos as something external rather than a storm I needed to manage alone. With him beside me, the noise felt less overwhelming, and I began to understand that I did not have to carry the weight of everyone else's reactions. As the conversations in Lexington continued, I realized the wedding had exposed more than a moment of absence. It had revealed years of imbalance that could no longer be ignored, and it pushed each of us toward a truth my family had avoided acknowledging. The aftermath created discomfort for them, clarity for me, and a path I knew I would eventually need to follow. When things finally stopped echoing around town, they came to my doorstep as if nothing had collapsed. I opened the door to find my parents and Meline standing together. Their presence felt heavy, not because of surprise, but because they acted as if the chaos they fueled had no weight at all. I stepped aside and let them in without a word, determined to face whatever they brought with a level head. My mother began speaking before anyone settled. Her voice carried that familiar urgency she used whenever she wanted control. She said she could not sleep after the wedding broadcast and insisted that everything had been a misunderstanding. Her attempt to smooth over what happened felt thin. I listened without interrupting because I needed her to show her own intentions before I revealed mine. My father waited for her to finish, and the quiet space he left afterward felt louder than her entire speech. He finally said he wanted to understand why I kept the wedding private. His tone carried a kind of regret that sounded real, but arrived far too late. I told him I had not hidden anything. I repeated the simple truth that they never once asked what the event was. I explained that I had given them every chance to care, yet each time they turned toward Meline's world without hesitation. Meline folded her arms and asked if this entire thing was some lesson I tried to teach. Her voice climbed as she questioned why my wedding needed to be live on television. I looked at her and said, "The broadcast happened because someone finally believed my life deserved visibility." I reminded her that she dismissed my engagement and treated the idea of my marriage as forgettable. Her eyes shifted, but she forced a smile that did not last long. My mother started crying while saying I had humiliated the family. I told her I had simply lived my life, and their humiliation came from their own decisions. She insisted that she had only been supporting Meline. I replied that support becomes favoritism when it erases another child entirely. She had no argument for that, and her silence revealed more than any excuse could. My father cleared his throat and said he could no longer deny the pattern. He confessed that he had watched my mother prioritize Meline for years while he remained passive. His voice carried shame when he admitted that he failed to protect balance in our home. Then he said the words none of us expected to hear. He said he wanted a separation because he could not continue living inside a structure that hurt both daughters while pretending it had not cracked. My mother stared at him as if every piece of her foundation had shifted beneath her. Meline reacted by blaming Jason for influencing me. I stopped her and reminded her that I had managed my life long before I married. I explained that independence is not manipulation, and her anger came from losing the spotlight. She tried to argue, but her voice wavered when she realized her sponsors had already stepped back from her after the broadcast. She whispered that everything was falling apart because of me. I told her lives collapse when they are built on denial. There was no shouting from me, no accusations designed to wound, only the truth they had avoided. When the room grew still, I told them this was the final conversation I would ever have with them. I said I needed peace, and peace required distance. My mother begged me to reconsider. My father closed his eyes as if accepting my words, and Meline muttered that I was ungrateful. I walked to the door and opened it without speaking again. They left one by one. I closed the door with a steady hand, knowing the line had been drawn for the last time. As time moved forward, I found myself stepping into a new rhythm that felt steady in ways I had not experienced before. Life with my husband Jason unfolded with a calm sense of purpose that helped me understand how heavy my past had been. We created routines that belonged entirely to us, and each day felt more grounded because there was no competition for attention or approval. I slowly learned to breathe without waiting for someone to compare me to my sister, or dismiss the meaning of my milestones. The distance from my old family structure allowed clarity to settle in. News reached me through acquaintances in Lexington who mentioned how quickly everything unraveled once the truth became visible. My father followed through with the separation he had spoken about, and people said he looked exhausted, yet strangely relieved. My mother struggled to navigate life without the dynamic she had relied on for years, and her attempts to protect the image of unity failed when she realized no one believed the explanations she offered. Meline attempted to rebuild her influence, but sponsors hesitated to associate with her. She lost several partnerships because the scandal made her seem unstable to companies that prize public trust. Her reaction was predictable, according to those who still cross paths with her. She blamed the industry, the timing, and me never acknowledging the choices that created the collapse. I heard these things without feeling bitterness, because the distance had grown wide enough to separate their turmoil from my peace. I did not regret the boundary I set. I honored what I needed for the first time, and the decision strengthened every part of my present life. Jason remained steady whenever memories resurfaced, and he reminded me that healing does not require permission from those who cause the wounds. His presence made it clear that I no longer lived in the shadow of a family that treated me as an afterthought. The experience taught me that loyalty should never demand self-erasure. I learned that love without balance becomes a weight that drags every part of life downward. Walking away from the people who refuse accountability does not mean abandoning compassion. It means choosing a version of yourself that deserves joy. Peace begins the moment you stop negotiating with someone who benefits from your silence. And growth becomes possible when you trust your own worth. Thank you for staying with my story until the end. Every experience carries a message, and I hope mine offered something meaningful to you. If you have ever faced a moment where choosing yourself felt impossible, I would love to hear your thoughts. Share your feelings or your own journey in the comments so we can continue this conversation together. Your voice might help someone who needs it.